Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Welcome back, everyone. I am so excited to introduce this week's interview with Shannon McKenna Schmidt. I connected with Shannon on social media over our shared admiration of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, proving that the internet hasn't lost all of its charms just yet. After devouring her book about Eleanor's daring journey during World War II, Shannon shared she was working on a book about Lady Bird Johnson, and I just knew I had to read it. Friends, it did not disappoint. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hello, everyone. Joining me today is Shannon McKenna Schmidt. She is an author whose work has appeared in publications such as National Geographic Traveler and History.com. She has written several books, including You Can't Catch Us, Lady Bird Johnson's Trailblazing 1964 campaign train, and The Women Who Rode with Her, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Shannon.
Well, thank you so much for having me on your very excellent program.
Thank you so much for being here. Let's dive in. How did you come to research this incredible story?
Well, this book actually came about because of another First Lady. I wrote a book called The First Lady of World War II about Eleanor Roosevelt's 5-week trip to the Pacific Theater during World War II, another history making journey. And after that, I was inspired to go find out if any other First Ladies had made momentous journeys as well. And there was Lady Bird Johnson whistle stopping down the tracks during the 1964 election and making history herself.
Well, and then how did Lady Bird Johnson's Whistle Stop Tour kind of come to fruition and what made it so historic?
Well, Lady Bird and her team were looking for ways for her to campaign in the South. And earlier in the year, LBJ had signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The South is seething, much of the South. They are especially angry because a Southern president put his full political weight behind getting the Civil Rights Act passed. And Lady Bird wants to campaign through the South for two reasons: to garner votes for LBJ's presidential reelection, but also to help ease the animosity and to help bridge this divide.
And you highlight how not everybody was on board. So, what was kind of the cause for some of the disagreements behind Mrs. Johnson's trip and how were they resolved?
Well, the fact is that LBJ didn't need the South to win the election. Polls had him leading widely over his Republican opponent, Barry Goldwater. And so some of the president's aides in the West Wing, they were a little prejudiced against the South, prejudiced against women, and they said, "Hey, we don't need the South. We don't need to allocate campaign resources to it. It's a lost cause anyway." They didn't really want women involved. But Lady Bird has been campaigning at this point for LBJ since his first run for the Senate in 1948. And she is a pro at it at this point. During the 1960 election, when LBJ was the vice presidential candidate on the ticket with JFK personally asked Lady Bird to take voter outreach, the lead in voter outreach to women. So 1964 comes around, and she's not going to let the fact that no first lady has ever campaigned before hold her back from doing this. And that's what made this so historic. Up until now, no first lady had taken a leading role on the campaign trail. But why, from her perspective, would she let this socially constructed gender barrier hold her back from something that she'd already been doing for years? And so off she and her team of women went into the South.
One of the things that I found really just incredible in reading the book was just the amount of extensive prep work that Lady Bird put into each stop. So can you talk a little bit about that and perhaps maybe why it was so important to her to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the newspaper headlines during the Whistle Stop tour said, Lady Bird demonstrates she did her homework for tour. And that was just very Lady Bird. If they were hosting a state dinner at the White House, for example, she would research every guest who would be in the receiving line so that she could make a personal connection with people. And every speech that Lady Bird gave on the whistle stop was customized for each location. She would touch on a lot of the same issues throughout the trip, but her talks were customized for every locale, and she had a team of 6 women who volunteered to help her write these more than 40 speeches before the train set out because they were all written. Nothing was left to the last minute, and I think Lady Bird's that personal connection in and the sincerity is what really resonated with people, and she's from the South, she's proud of the South, and I really think that nobody else but Lady Bird, because of those reasons, could have successfully made this trip.
Yeah. Well, and I think anybody who's even remotely familiar with Lady Bird Johnson and Lyndon Johnson kind of know that they are very different people. So, how did Mrs. Johnson differ in style and substance from her husband on the campaign trail?
Well, LBJ was very much a showman, more gregarious, more hard hitting. He would even throw his Stetson hat into the crowd sometimes. And Lady Bird, she used a lighter touch while still getting across her political points. And she herself said that she was not a hard sell person, but again, she was so sharp, so smart, and she also had that sincerity. In 1960, her speeches were lauded as sheer magic by the press. So again, for the Lady Bird special, she's drawing on this history, this experience that she's developed over a decade or more.
Yeah. Well, and so you were kind of motivated yourself in researching Lady Bird's whistle stop tour by your previous book on Eleanor Roosevelt, but you also write in the book how First Lady Johnson was compared to Eleanor Roosevelt, which I thought that's kinda kismet because I've also read your book on Eleanor Roosevelt. So, what about these women kind of drew comparisons, and I guess too, how were they different?
I think it's something that might surprise us today because I was a little surprised, and like you said, the kismet, I was also very pleased to find out that Eleanor Roosevelt was Lady Bird's role model as First Lady, both as a traveler and an activist. And like Eleanor, Lady Bird crisscrossed the country. She wanted to information gather for the president. She wanted to be, like Eleanor, this link between the Oval Office and the American people. And shortly after Lady Bird became First Lady, a reporter did a cover feature on her for the Saturday Evening Post, a very huge magazine at the time. And she said, Mrs. Johnson will be the most political First Lady since Eleanor Roosevelt. She is more than an elected official's wife. She has herself become a consummate politician. And the reporter also noted a significant difference between Eleanor and Lady Bird. They said that Eleanor had a political life of her own, while Lady Bird had only ever worked politically for her husband. But both Eleanor and Lady Bird believed that the government, starting with their president husbands, had a responsibility to use the government to improve people's lives.
Well, and I think the other thing that kinda came through in this book is kind of the tone that First Lady Johnson set, and kind of the role model kind of that she was for women. So, can you talk a little bit about how did Lady Bird Johnson kinda serve as a role model to women who were maybe looking for an example of something different than the quote unquote standard housewife that was really prevalent in this time period?
Yes, it was a very interesting time, a shifting time. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique had been published the year before and really upended this belief that women's fulfillment came solely through domesticity, which was the pendulum swinging back the other way after the Rosie the Riveter generation. We think of them breaking all these barriers. And then women were kind of pushed back into domesticity solely. And this was something that was reinforced by every aspect of society, from advertising to your peer groups. Then along comes Lady Bird in 1964, so 1 year about a year and a half after The Feminine Mystique is published, and she's just doing her thing. She's coming down the tracks. She and a lot of other women on the train are doing the things that they've always done. Lady Bird identifies herself as a wife, mother, businesswoman, and politician. And because she also, in addition to being LBJ's political partner in a lot of ways, she also ran her own business. She bought a rundown, debt ridden radio station in Austin, Texas, and she transformed it into a media conglomerate. She considered being First Lady a daily working job, and she was the first to professionalize the role by hiring a staff director and a team to work on her projects. And the next year in 1965, so the whistle stop would have taken place in the fall of 64. And the next year, Margaret Mead, who was at the time a Red Book columnist, she said, Mrs. Johnson is giving us a model of what other American women can do and be in the mid 20th century. And she was also at the end of 1964 declared by the Associated Press the Woman Newsmaker of the Year, partly for her travels. So she really is emerged as a role model for women at the time.
Yeah, and I think it was, she's kind of a safe role model, right? She's still feminine. She still defers to her husband, but she was still her own woman. She was a media, owner.
That is an excellent point, and I'm so glad you brought that up because I do think she's almost the perfect person at the perfect time because she was able to bridge this bridge between the traditional and the progressive. Earlier in 1964, she had given a commencement speech at Radcliffe College, and she told the graduating seniors that your brains, your intelligence doesn't have to be a threat to your femininity. And she said ultimately it comes back to the spirit in which you can direct your own life. How happily you can marry both man and job or how happily you can marry one. And these were very progressive words at the time. And I loved another newspaper headline. You can tell I love getting into the newspaper databases. It said, Radcliffe seniors hear Lady Bird describe the modern US woman.
See, perfect. So returning to the tour a little bit. So it's teen 60s. We're in the aftermath of LBJ signing the civil rights bill. Several people in the South are very upset. So we're sending the first lady down to campaign for her husband. This is a historic event in and of itself, but also now we've got some additional concerns. This is in the aftermath of John F. Kennedy's assassination. So there are some legitimate security concerns. So can you talk about the security protocols that were put in place to kind of safeguard the first lady during her tour to make sure that she was safe?
Yes, it's hard to distance how the utterly tragic circumstances that brought LBJ and Lady Bird to the White House, and also that the assassination happened in their home state of Texas. And this was this shadow is still hanging over the nation even 10 months later. And a whistle stop through the South was deemed too dangerous for LBJ to make. The Secret Service thought that nearly 2,000 miles of railroad track would be too challenging to protect. And in fact, when it was announced to the press, the whistle stop, an informant came to the FBI to tell them that a gun runner for the KKK in Mississippi had tried to talk other people into plotting to blow up a bridge on which the train would travel. So the Secret Service was actually very nervous about even Lady Bird taking this trip, and the precautions were so extensive. They canvassed towns ahead of time. They coordinated with local law enforcement. In some of the photos of Lady Bird on this back platform on a car train she spoke, you can kind of tell who some of the Secret Service agents are with their sunglasses because they flanked the platform every time she spoke. They circulated among the crowd, and the law enforcement had a special colored hat pin in their lapel so that they could identify each other. Three helicopters accompanied the train the entire way, and the Secret Service also insisted that an extra engine precede the train by 15 minutes in case the tracks were bombed. And this was something that weighed very heavily on Lady Bird's conscience.
Such a heavy moment to what was an otherwise kind of historic, monumental, record breaking event. And, it not every stop was welcoming. So, and not every stop was easy. So, can you talk about some of the more hostile areas, such as when Mrs. Johnson arrived in Charleston, South Carolina?
Yes, it was a lot lighter through Virginia and North Carolina. There were thousands of people at every stop. There were always a smattering of Goldwater supporters. They had their little signs, but they were largely respectful. That all changed when the train went into South Carolina, Columbia, and then Charleston in particular. In Colombia, a and again, there's a crowd of, I think, like 9,000 people, but a very small group of about 25 people would these groups, they would do this repeatedly throughout the trip. They would surge near the speaker's platform, yelling, heckling, taunting, and in Colombia, this group seemed organized because they acted when somebody raised a crutch in the air and gave them the symbol to do that. Their derogatory signs, and Lady Bird's press secretary Liz Carpenter said that in Colombia, that was the real first ugly display of hostility and that it left all of them aghast. But Lady Bird, she's a pro, and there's recordings of this speech and a lot of her speeches, and she gave a master class in daring and diplomacy. And during her speech, they got very vocal, and she just looked at them, she raised her right hand, and she politely reprimanded them, and they were quiet for the rest of the speech. So the train then continues on, and in Charleston, some of these same people followed the train to Charleston, and there was a bigger, more organized group there. And this would happen frequently through the rest of the South and Savannah and some other places. But Lady Bird's attitude was so great, and when a reporter asked her about the incidences in Charleston and Columbia, she said, "Look, you have to keep it all in perspective. Thousands and thousands of people have turned out to hear us and have been excited, and it's just a handful of people who have done the heckling." And in all, Lady Bird addressed about 500,000 people during this trip. I think it would have been really hard for people not to know what their first lady was up to, because, of course, all this then got disseminated in the media. There were many reporters on board. It was in newspapers nationwide. It was on all of the major evening news programs. So, yeah, it got quite ugly at times, but she just handled it spectacularly.
Yeah. It was the way you recount the story was very I've always had a lot of respect for Lady Bird Johnson. I went into the book with a lot of respect for Lady Bird Johnson, but it just kind of reminded me of how above board she was and her ability to kind of command a crowd. So it was it was a poignant story as I was reading through it of just, she knew she was in a hostile territory, but she wasn't going to let them rattle her, and she was going to be respectful, and she was kind of remind them of why she was there. So it was a hard story to read in the sense of like, oh man, come on, just let her do her speech, but also she wasn't going to get rattled. So I appreciated her being strong.
Yes, and again, I mean, so you came into this book knowing stuff about Lady Bird Johnson, and so you probably, yeah, that she was maybe the perfect person, the only person who could have done this because of her reverence and her love for the South and her experience in campaigning.
Oh yeah. Well, and then in researching your book, you got a chance to speak with the Johnson daughters. So what was that experience like?
That I am just so grateful that they each took the time to talk with me. It was so special to have that link to people who were actually on the campaign train. And at the time, so 20-year-old Linda, 17-year-old Lucy, and they were superb. They were speaking to audiences, they were facing down hecklers with poise, and they were popular with everyone, but they were especially popular with the really surprisingly large amount of young people who turned out for this trip. And the title of the book, You Can't Catch Us, actually comes from something that Linda said at one of the stops. And the train was leaving a stop in North Carolina, and some boys ran after the train with some pro Goldwater signs. And Linda flipped on the loudspeaker and she cheerfully schooled them. And she said, "You're running after the 20th century. You can't catch us." And so that eventually became the book's title because it emulates the forward momentum of the campaign train, but also the surrounding social progress and women's rights and civil rights that were taking place at the time.
Hey, I'm just so I read that in the back of the book and I thought, "Oh my god, I'm so jealous." Okay, and so as we've discussed, you've also written, about First Lady Roosevelt's travels. So this is kind of your second foray into writing about first ladies kinda taking on dangerous missions in support of their country and of their husbands' careers. And so I'm curious, what kind of drew you to sharing these particular moments? And why do you think they're important for people to know?
Well, nothing lights my fire like stories about badass women. And Lady Bird and Eleanor were certainly two of those. And what drew to me to both of these stories was each of their bravery and they're willing to face discomfort and danger to make a difference. I mean, neither one had to make these trips, and yet they did. And they also shared that same sense of sincerity and advocacy and inclusivity. And on the whistle stop, Ladybird, she didn't want to see anybody left behind. And it's really, really their bravery that spoke to me and wanting to make society better for people, even when it's hard to do.
Their authenticities kind of sprung out to me in both of the books. You do a really good job of kind of laying bare who they were as individuals. So that really comes through in both books. And so, what do you think modern audiences can learn from this part of Lady Bird Johnson's story?
Well, as I was thinking about things and equating 1964 to today, I mean, and Eleanor as well, obviously during World War II, they both took their trips during times of upheaval. And what the American public saw were their first ladies really as heroes in motion. And they're exhibiting qualities that are timeless. They're capable, they're confident, they're compassionate, they're courageous. And I think all of us maybe could look at this and take this example of rising to meet the moment.
And this might be expanding upon the prior answer, but what do you hope readers take away from this book?
Well, one of the things that I was really struck by with the story of the Ladybird special was not only just this extraordinary group of trailblazing women brought together on this train, but their sense of camaraderie.
Hmm,
And I really I would like for readers to come away inspired and empowered to recognize injustice, to take
mhm.
action, and we should realize this power that we all have in the collective to make historic change. And really, it's this coming together of this team of women who then were able to make change and make history.
Definitely. And where should people go when they've finished your book and they want to learn more about you and the work that you do?
If they are so inclined, they could visit my website, which is shannonmckennaschmidt.com.
And is there anything that we haven't covered that you want future readers to know?
The last thing I would say is I think readers might be surprised by the Lady Bird Johnson that they meet and they see in this book. And it's an adventurous ride down the tracks with, like I said, Lady Bird and her crew of extraordinary women. And Lady Bird herself said that of the 3 decades that she spent on the political scene alongside LBJ, that the whistle stop were the 4 most dramatic days in her political life.
Wonderful sentiment to end on. So, for the listeners out there, Definitely run out, grab yourself a copy of You Can't Catch Us. It is a beautifully written, fast paced, engaging narrative of an underexplored moment in political history. You will gain a new perspective and a new appreciation for Lady Bird Johnson, and you will not be able to put it down. Thank you again, Shannon.
Well, thank you so much. I've had a lot of fun. So thank you.
My thanks again to Shannon for sharing her time with me and for an incredible book highlighting the work of Lady Bird Johnson. If you have an interest in politics, women's history, or the work of First Ladies, then I hope you consider picking up a copy of You Can't Catch Us. You won't be able to put it down. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next time. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.